Harlan Veyne didn't wait for the coffin to be in the ground before he started talking. That was the part Lenora would never forget. Her father Beatty was still laid out in the front room of the house she'd grown up in, still cooling under the quilt her mother had sewn 30 years ago. Most of its windows were dark, and Harlan was already standing at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey in his hand, telling Bram what the cattle were worth. She stood in the doorway and listened. Neither of them looked up. 3 days later, when the lawyer read the will in front of the whole family, Harlan didn't even try to hide the smile. Her brothers got the ranch, the cattle, the equipment, the water rights, the money in the bank, the horses in the barn, and the house she'd cooked and cleaned and kept running for the last decade of her life. Lenora got Red Hollow, a barren canyon 50 miles south that nobody had ever found a use for. Harlan set his whiskey glass down on the lawyer's desk and looked at her across the table. "Well," he said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "I guess Father finally found the perfect place for a woman nobody wanted." The room went quiet. Lenora felt the blood drain from her face. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago not to give Harlan the satisfaction of watching her cry. But she also didn't have a single word left to say to him. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if you've ever had someone look right through you, like you weren't even worth the trouble of an insult, stay with this story. Because what happened to Lenora Veyne in that canyon is something I think about every time someone tells me what a person is and isn't capable of. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes. We have more stories like this one coming, and they only get more extraordinary. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Lenora. The morning after the will was read, Lenora woke before dawn and sat on the edge of her bed in the room she'd slept in since she was a girl. She looked at the walls, the small cracked mirror above the washstand, the chest of drawers she'd refinished herself 3 summers ago when the finish started peeling, the curtains she'd sewn from a bolt of blue calico her father had brought back from Tucson as a birthday gift when she was 19. None of it was hers anymore. Technically, the house now belonged to Harlan and Bram, and she had about as much claim to that blue curtain as she did to the barn or the well or the good iron skillet she'd used every morning for the last 8 years. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. Her body ached, same as it always did in the mornings. She was a large woman, had been since her early 20s, and the ache in her knees and hips was as familiar to her as the sound of the roosters starting up outside. People looked at her body and assumed she was soft. They'd been making that assumption her whole life, and she'd spent her whole life quietly disproving it, hauling feed, mending fence lines in the January cold, staying up through the night with a sick calf while Harlan and Bram were sleeping, but none of it seemed to change what they saw when they looked at her. She stood up. Her knees protested. She ignored them. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, same as she did every morning. When Harlan came down the stairs an hour later and found her sitting at the table with the deed to Red Hollow flattened out in front of her, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way you'd look at a stray dog that had somehow gotten into the house. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading," she said. "Reading what?" "What Father left me." He made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't anything friendlier. He poured himself a cup of her coffee without asking and leaned against the counter. "Lenora, Red Hollow is a hole in the ground. You understand that, right? There's no water, no grass, no nothing. Just rock and heat and the kind of rattlesnakes that'll get you before you even see them." She didn't look up from the deed. "Then I guess I'll have to watch where I step. You're not seriously thinking about going out there." She folded the deed carefully along its original creases, stood up and carried her coffee cup to the sink. "I'm leaving in the morning," she said. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let me take Copper." Harlan stared at her. Copper was a 20-year-old buckskin gelding, half blind in one eye and too old for real ranch work, but he was the horse her father had given her when she was 12 years old, and she loved him with the kind of loyalty that didn't have much to do with usefulness. "Take the horse," Harlan said finally, like he was doing her some enormous favor. "Take whatever fits in your saddlebags. The rest stays." She nodded and went upstairs to pack. She didn't take much. A change of clothes, her father's old canteen, a bedroll, the small skinning knife she'd carried since she was 16, a bag of dried beans and a bag of cornmeal, flint and steel. Her father's compass, which she'd found in his coat pocket the morning he died, and which she'd kept without telling anyone, which maybe wasn't entirely honest, but which she'd decided to do anyway. She didn't sleep much that last night. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about her father. Edmund Veyne had not been a sentimental man. He wasn't the kind of father who said things like "I'm proud of you" out loud, not to anyone, not even to Harlan, who'd always been his favorite in the way that oldest sons so often were without anyone having to say so. But there had been windows were dark, but there had been moments, quiet ones, unremarked on, when Lenora had looked up from some task and found her father watching her with an expression she'd never been quite able to name. Not pity. Not the absent-minded fondness people sometimes showed towards something harmless and unimportant. Something else, something she hadn't had words for then, and wasn't sure she had words for now. She'd assumed the will would prove she'd misread him. Now she wasn't entirely sure. She left before sunup, before Harlan or Bram were awake. She didn't say goodbye to the house. She didn't think it would have done either of them any good. She loaded her saddlebags, checked Copper's cinch twice, and rode south into the dark. The first day was hard in the ordinary way, long, hot, dry, the kind of hard she was used to. The desert between the ranch and Red Hollow was not the dramatic landscape people imagined when they pictured Arizona territory. It was mostly flat scrub, gray-green brush, the occasional saguaro standing like a scarecrow against the sky, and a sun that by mid-morning felt like something personal, like it had decided to settle a score specifically with her. She rationed her water carefully. She'd filled the canteen at the ranches well before she left, and she had a second smaller vessel she'd found in the barn. And she was good at rationing, had been since childhood, had always been the one in the family who noticed when things were running low before anyone else did, but by the end of the first day, her mouth was dry enough that talking felt like an effort, which was fine, because there was no one to talk to. She made camp beside a dry wash and ate cold beans from the bag and listened to the desert do what desert does at night, which is get cold very fast and fill up with sounds that are mostly nothing, but occasionally something. Copper stood nearby, his one good eye half closed, his breath slow and even. She'd had that horse for 14 years. She reached over and put her hand on his nose in the dark, and he didn't move, just breathed against her palm, and that was the closest thing to comfort she had that night, and it was enough. The second day was harder. The terrain changed. The flat scrub gave way to broken ground, dry creek beds, rock formations that forced her to pick her way around rather than through. The heat came earlier and lasted longer. By afternoon, Copper was moving slower than she liked, and she dismounted and walked beside him for the last 2 hours before she made camp, which meant she was walking in the heat too, but she wasn't going to push the old horse harder than was fair. Her knees ached, her back ached. The blisters on her heels from her boots, which she hadn't broken in properly, and which she'd been meaning to address for 2 months, had turned into something that made each step its own small negotiation. She thought about Harlan's face when she told him she was going. She thought about the room full of people at the lawyer's office, the way they'd all very carefully not looked at her when he read the will, the way sympathy and second-hand embarrassment look almost identical on people's faces, the way she'd sat in that chair with her hands folded in her lap and kept her face very still. She used the thought like a whetstone, sharpened herself against it. The third day she found Red Hollow. She almost missed the entrance. It was a narrow gap in the rock, barely wide enough for Copper to pass through if she kept him moving straight and didn't rush him. The canyon walls rose up on both sides almost immediately, 50 feet, then 100, then higher, sheer red sandstone that turned the afternoon light into something amber and strange, the kind of light that made everything look like it was already a memory. The floor of the canyon was dry creek bed and loose rock and thorn brush, the kind of mesquite that grows low and mean and grabs at everything that passes. There was no obvious water, no grass. A few scraggly desert willows near what must have been, sometime in the geological past, a water source, but which was now just pale, cracked mud, baked to the consistency of old brick. Lenora stopped Copper just inside the entrance and looked at what her father had left her. The late sun turned the canyon walls to fire. Shadows pooled in the crevices. A hawk, or something that might have been a hawk, turned lazy circles very high above, catching the thermal she couldn't feel from down here. She felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not despair. She told herself she wasn't going to let it be despair, but it was something close to it. She made camp near the canyon entrance that night because she was too tired and too footsore and too low on water to push any further in. She gave Copper the last of the water from the second vessel and kept only what was in the canteen. She ate the rest of the beans cold again and sat with her back against the canyon wall and looked up at the strip of stars visible between the canyon walls. Her father had worked his whole life. He'd built that ranch from nothing. He'd told her once, on land that wasn't much better than this, back before she was born, back when he was young enough that his knees didn't ache, and he thought hardship was temporary rather than the general texture of existence. Why here, she thought. Why give me this? She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure there was one. She closed her eyes. She'd give it one more day. She owed herself that much one more day before she had to figure out what came next. She woke before dawn again, which was a habit she couldn't break even, when she had no particular reason to be awake at that hour, and she sat in the gray pre-light and drank the last of her water and accepted the headache that was already building behind her eyes as the price of doing business. She was going to have to find water today, or she was going to have to turn around and ride back north, which was a kind of failure she was not prepared to contemplate in any detail. She started working her way deeper into the canyon. It was slow going. The mesquite was thick in places, and she had to break branches to get Copper through, and the loose rock on the canyon floor was the kind that rolled underfoot and was harder on her ankles than flat ground. The sun didn't reach the canyon floor until nearly mid-morning, and when it did, it came in hard and direct, no shade worth mentioning, the canyon walls radiating heat back at her from both sides. She found her father's pickaxe at the base of the western wall. She almost walked past it. It was half buried in a drift of blown sand, and the handle had weathered to a silver gray that blended with the surrounding rock. But something made her stop, some half-conscious flicker of recognition at the shape or the angle of the iron head catching the light. She crouched down and dug it out with her hands. The handle was old but not rotted. The iron head was rusted on the surface but solid underneath. And on the flat of the head, in small, neat strokes, someone had cut a mark she knew as well as she knew her own face. Her father's blacksmith stamp, the small V with a line through it that he'd put on everything he made or owned since before Harlan was born. She sat ceased with that pickaxe across her knees and felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the desert. He'd been here, not once, not just passing through. He'd worked here, hard enough that he'd brought tools and left them. She looked up at the canyon walls with entirely different eyes. The western cliff face was the tallest 200 feet, if it was anything, sheer sandstone, with a series of natural ledges and outcroppings about 2/3 of the way up. She studied it for a long time. Her eyes traced the cliff the way she'd learned to read the landscape of the ranch, not looking for the obvious, but looking for what didn't quite fit, what interrupted the pattern. There, high up, where a narrow ledge curved around an outcropping, something that caught the light wrong, not reflecting it, not absorbing it the way sandstone did. Something that fractured it, broke it into points. Glass. She stared at it until her neck ached from looking up. Then she looked at the pickaxe in her hands. Then she looked at the cliff face and the piles of loose rock at its base, and the dense thorn scrub covering most of the lower slope. Most of its windows were dark, and she did the honest math of what it would take to get up there and came out with a number that frightened her a little. But she'd come 50 miles across open desert on a half-blind horse with a bad case of blisters and 2 canteens of water to get here. She picked up the pickaxe. She started clearing brush. Her hands blistered within the first hour. Her shoulders were burning by the second. The mesquite didn't give up without a fight. The root systems were deep and stubborn, and the branches were covered in thorns that didn't discriminate between cloth and skin. She bled in small ways on her forearms, on the backs of her hands, in the crease of her knuckle, where she'd gripped the handle wrong, and the wood had bitten into her. She kept working. She thought about Harlan's voice in that room, the sound of it, the easy cruelty of it, the way it hadn't even cost him anything. That was the thing about cruelty that came so naturally to a person it was cheap for them. It cost Lenora something to carry it. It cost him nothing to throw it. She thought about the years she'd spent in that kitchen, in those pastures, in the cold barns in the hot summers, doing the work that kept the ranch running while her brothers did the visible work, the work people remembered and told stories about, the work that had their names attached to it. She swung the pickaxe into the base of a particularly stubborn mesquite and felt it connect with something that wasn't root. She pulled the blade back, looked down. Stone, flat and deliberately placed, not natural to the canyon floor. She dropped to her knees and started clearing sand away with her hands. A path, narrow but cut and set real stone work, someone's deliberate labor leading up the cliff face toward that ledge, and whatever waited at the end of it. Her father's hands had built this. She sat back on her heels and breathed, and for the first time since she'd ridden away from the ranch in the dark, something in her chest loosened just slightly, like a knot that had been pulled tight for days beginning, at long last, to consider releasing. She didn't know yet what was up there, but she was going to find out. She didn't climb that day. She was out of water and her hands were bleeding and the sun already passed a peak, which meant she had maybe 4 hours of good light left, and climbing 200 feet of sandstone cliff face without water, without rest. Most of its windows were dark, and without knowing what was up there was the kind of decision that got people killed in the desert. She knew that. She'd grown up in this country. She understood the math of it, even when everything in her wanted to ignore it. So she made herself stop. She tied Copper to the sturdiest piece of brush she could find near the base of the cliff, unsaddled him so he could breathe easier in the heat, and spent the remaining afternoon doing something more practical than climbing. She cleared the stone path. It was harder work than it looked. The path her father had cut into the cliff base was covered in years of blown sand and debris mesquite leaves, small rocks, a dead lizard that had been there long enough to be nothing but dry skin over hollow bone. She worked with the pickaxe and her bare hands, following the line of the deliberately laid stones up the slope, clearing what she could reach, marking in her mind what would need more attention tomorrow when she was better rested and had water in her. The path curved once, then again, following the natural contour of the rock. Wherever the slope steepened, her father had cut narrow steps into the sandstone itself, rough work, not pretty, but solid. She tested each one with her boot before trusting it. They held. She stopped when the light started going orange. She'd cleared maybe 60 feet of path, maybe a third of the way up to that ledge. Not enough to reach whatever was up there, but enough to know the path was real, continuous, and built by someone who had done this many times and knew what they were doing. She went back to Copper and leaned against his side for a while, just standing there in the cooling air while the canyon walls went from amber to red to something almost purple in the last of the light. She was thirsty enough that her tongue felt thick. Her headache had settled in behind her right eye in the particular way that meant she needed water soon, not just eventually. She'd gone without water before longer than this once, when she was 19 and got turned around for half a day in rough country north of the ranch, but that didn't mean it was comfortable. She needed to find water by morning, or she needed to leave, and she wasn't ready to leave. She made herself eat the last of her cornmeal dry, washing it down with the absolute minimum from the canteen 3 swallows, no more. And then she sat with her back against the cliff and looked up at the narrow strip of sky between the canyon walls and tried to think like her father. Edmund Veyne had built this path for a reason. He'd brought his tools here and his labor here, had spent enough time in this canyon that he'd left his pickaxe behind. He wasn't a man who wasted effort. He'd built the ranch up from nothing on that principle alone. Every hour of work was accounted for. Every dollar spent had to justify itself. Every decision got measured against whether it was earning or wasting. He would not have spent his energy building a path to nothing, which meant whatever was at the top of that ledge was worth the climb, which also meant, almost certainly, that he had found a reason to come back here more than once. And a man who came back to a desert canyon more than once either had supplies waiting for him somewhere, or he found water. She was betting on water. She just had to survive long enough to find it. She slept, waking twice to the sound of things moving in the dark, small things, probably rodents or lizards, and once to Copper shifting his weight and blowing out a long breath that sounded almost like a comment on the situation. By the time the sky between the canyon walls went gray with early light, she was already on her feet, already reaching for the pickaxe. She worked through the morning cool, which was the only mercy the desert offered. And she took it. The upper section of the path was steeper than the lower, and the steps her father had cut were narrower, more closely spaced. Her thighs burned. Her knees complained in the register they'd been complaining in for 3 years now. The deep ache that came with carrying her weight up any significant incline, but she'd learned to work through that ache the way you learned to work through anything, by deciding that it wasn't the thing that was going to stop her. She was about 100 feet up when she found the first cache. It was set into a small, natural hollow in the cliff face, low enough to miss if you weren't looking, covered with a flat piece of sandstone fitted so carefully into the opening that it looked like natural rock from more than 3 feet away. She spotted it only because the edge of the cover stone was a slightly different color than the surrounding cliff, less weathered. She pried it loose with the pickaxe blade, inside a clay jug sealed with wax, a tin of matches, a coil of good rope, a folded oilskin that turned out to contain, when she shook it open, a pair of heavy leather work gloves, cracked with age but still intact. She lifted the clay jug and felt liquid shift inside it. She almost broke the wax seal right there. Her hands actually moved to do it before she stopped herself and thought it through. If the seal had held, the water inside was clean. If she broke it now, up here on the cliff face, she'd have to manage the jug and the pickaxe and the rest of the climb with one hand while drinking with the other. And that was a good way to drop something important, or, worse, herself. She tucked the jug under her arm and kept climbing. The ledge she'd been aiming for was narrower than it had looked from the canyon floor, maybe 3 feet wide at its broadest, tapering in places to barely more than a foot. But it was solid, and it ran along the cliff face for a good 30 feet before it curved around the outcropping she'd been using as a landmark. She followed it around the curve and stopped. The window was about 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, set directly into the sandstone, framed with rough-cut timber that had gone gray with age. The glass in it was old, the kind of wavy, imperfect glass that caught light and bent it, which explained why it had flashed at her from the canyon floor 2 days ago. Beside it, fitted so precisely in the rock face that she'd almost missed it, even standing 3 feet away, was a door. Not a gap in the stone, a door. Timber framed, iron hinged, the latch a simple iron lift bar design she recognized from her father's blacksmith work. She stood if its windows were dark. She stood on that narrow ledge 200 feet above the canyon floor and looked at this door her father had built into the side of a cliff and felt something move through her that she didn't have words for right then. Most of its windows were dark, something that lived in the same neighborhood as grief and wonder, and the particular, complicated feeling of discovering that someone knew you better than you thought they did. She put her hand on the latch. It lifted. The door swung inward on hinges that were stiff but not frozen, protesting the movement with a low metallic groan that echoed briefly in whatever space was behind it. Cool air moved out against her face, real coolness, not just the relative cool of shade, but the deep, steady cool of stone that never sees direct sunlight, that holds the temperature of the earth rather than the sky. She ducked through the doorway and stood still for a long time, letting her eyes adjust. The space was larger than she'd expected. The ceiling was high enough for her to stand fully upright. Edmund Veyne had been a tall man, and he'd built this for his own comfort, which meant Lenora had room to spare. The main chamber was roughly rectangular, maybe 20 feet deep and 15 wide, with walls that were partly natural sandstone and partly something her father had smoothed and shaped with tools. The floor was flat stone, worn smooth in a path between the doorway and a low workbench along the far wall. There were shelves. Not fancy ones, rough timber brackets, the kind her father had built in every barn and outbuilding on the ranch, but solid and carefully leveled. On the shelves, tin canisters, sealed and labeled in her father's neat block letters. Tools hung on iron pegs, rope coiled, a second oilskin laid over something on the workbench, a folded wool blanket on a low wooden platform that served as a sleeping shelf. And in the back corner, coming out of the rock itself, through a narrow channel her father had carved and fitted with a clay pipe, water. Not a trickle. A real flow, small but steady, maybe a finger's width, running down into a stone basin he'd built at the base, and then out through a second pipe that she followed with her eyes to where it disappeared into the floor, presumably draining down through the rock, somewhere below. She crossed the room in 4 steps and cupped her hands under the flow. It was cold and clean and tasted like nothing at all, which was the taste of weecher that came from deep in the earth, filtered through limestone and sandstone until everything that had ever been wrong with it was gone. She drank until her headache began to recede. She splashed water on her face. She held her cut and blistered hands under the flow and felt the sting of it and didn't care. Then she sat on the floor of her father's hidden room with her back against the cool stone wall and cried for the first time since the will was read. Not from grief, exactly. Or not only from grief. It was the other kind of crying. The kind that happens when you've been carrying something heavier than you realized until the moment you're finally allowed to set it down. She let herself have about 10 minutes of it. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, got up, and went to see what else her father had left her. The tin canisters on the shelves contained dried beans, cornmeal, dried apples, coffee, salt, sugar, enough to last a single person 2 weeks if they were careful, maybe 3 if they stretched it. They were old, some of the seals were starting to go, and she'd need to go through them carefully, but the storage was dry and cool, and most of it was still good. The tools were her father's work throughout. She recognized the hammer, the 2 different chisels, the set of iron measuring rods. All of it bore his blacksmith mark. The oilskin on the workbench covered a tin box, the kind people used to store documents or valuables. It was latched but not locked. She stood over it for a moment with her hands on the lid and made herself breathe before she opened it. Inside a journal, hard-backed, the leather worn soft with handling, and a folded piece of paper, separate from the journal, with her name written on the outside in her father's handwriting. She picked up the paper first, her hands shaking, which she noticed and was irritated by and couldn't do anything about. She unfolded it. The note was short. Her father had never been a man who used 10 words when 3 would do. Lenora, you're here, which means you're smarter and braver than anyone gave you credit for, myself included, for too long. I'm sorry it took me so long to show you this place. There is more here than what you can see. Read the journal. All of it. Start at the beginning and don't skip ahead. I know you'll want to skip ahead. Don't eat. V. She read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the sleeping shelf with the journal in her lap and opened it to the first page. Her father had started it 12 years ago. The first entry was short and practical. The way all of his first attempts at anything were: found the spring by accident following a loose steer into the canyon. Water is real and clean. Came back with tools. This place has possibilities. The second entry, written 6 weeks later, cut the first steps. Hard work. Worth it. She read slowly, moving through entries that were sometimes weeks apart and sometimes months. Her father hadn't been a daily journal keeper. He wrote when something changed or when he needed to think something through. The early entries were almost purely practical measurements, materials, the problems of building in stone without proper equipment and without anyone to help him. But around the 3rd year of entries, something shifted. He'd started writing about her. Not in a direct way. Not at first. It started with observations. Lenora fixed the north fence line alone this week. Didn't mention it. Lenora found the calf with the bad hoof before I did, and had it already treated by the time I got to the barn. Harlan made a joke at dinner about Lenora's cooking. She laughed along with him. I don't think it was as funny to her as she made it look. The entries built on each other. Year after year of her father watching her, noticing what he didn't say out loud, recording in this hidden journal the things he apparently couldn't bring himself to say to her face. She understands the accounts better than either of the boys. I've watched her correct Harlan's figures when she thought nobody was looking. She was right every time. Harlan and Bram see property as something to own and use. Lenora sees it differently. She sees what a piece of land could become. I made a mistake when she was young. I let her believe that what people said about her was my opinion too. It wasn't. But I was a coward about saying so, and now she's 22 years old, and I'm not sure she knows her own worth. Lenora stopped reading. She looked at the wall, at the steady trickle of water into the stone basin, at the cool, gray light coming through the small window. She thought about being 22 years old and sitting at the dinner table while Harlan said something clever, and everyone laughed, including her, and her father sitting at the head of the table with his face unreadable, the way it always was. She'd thought that unreadable face meant he agreed with them. She turned the page. The entries in the later years were longer, more careful. He'd begun describing Red Hollow in detail, not just the cliff house, but the canyon itself, the geology of it. He'd found a second spring, smaller, near the canyon's eastern wall. He'd traced where the water came from, following the geology with the instinct of a man who'd spent 50 years reading land for a living. He'd found something else, too. She read the entry twice to make sure she was understanding it correctly. The soil in the canyon floor is better than it looks. The flooding from monsoons carries mineral sediment down from the mountains and deposits it in the low sections. With water and the right technique, this ground would grow things. I've tested it. I was surprised. And then 2 entries later, I think Lenora should have this place. I've been going back and forth on it for 2 years. The boys would fight over it, and it would end up being about power and money instead of what it could be. Lenora would see it differently. She always does. She closed the journal, not because she didn't want to read more, because she needed a minute to be a person sit in a room before she could keep being a reader processing information. Her father had left her Red Hollow on purpose, not as a consolation, not as the bottom of the pile after Harlan and Bram got the real inheritance. He'd left her this specific place because he understood something about her that she hadn't fully understood about herself, that she didn't need what was already built. She needed the room to build. She sat with that for a long time. Outside, the sun had moved enough that the angle of light through the small window had changed, and what had been a bar of yellow light across the floor was now a narrow stripe near the ceiling. She'd been in here longer than she'd realized. She got up and went to the doorway and looked out at the canyon below. Copper was where she'd left him, standing with his head down in the shade of the cliff. The canyon floor was a mess of shadow and rock and thorn brush, the path she'd been clearing visible as a pale line through the darker debris. She looked at the canyon the way her father had described, looking at the ranch land when he was young, not as what it was, but as what it could be. She went back inside. She spent the rest of that day going through the journal methodically, the way her father had told her to, start to finish, no skipping. She made herself read slowly, even when the entries were painful, and some of them were. The ones where he'd written about his own failings as a father, the things he wished he'd said and hadn't, the times he'd let Harlan set the tone at the table and said nothing. He was honest in the journal in a way he'd never been in conversation. She supposed that was true of a lot of people, easier to be truthful on paper, when there's no face across the table to make it complicated. By the time the light from the window had gone soft and golden, with late afternoon, she'd reached the last third of the journal, and her father had gotten to the practical material, the irrigation calculations, the planting suggestions, the detailed notes about the monsoon patterns in the canyon and how the floodwater moved and where it settles and what you'd need to build to control it rather than just survive it. He'd drawn maps, careful, measured ones with distances noted and landmarks keyed, and the two marked with small asterisks. He'd planned this out over 12 years. He'd given her not just a place, but a blueprint. She set the journal down on the workbench and looked at the wall of tools hanging on their pegs. The hammer, the chisels, the measuring rods. Her father's hands had hung each of those on their pegs. Her father's hands had cut the steps in the stone outside and smoothed the floor under her feet and fit the door into the rock face. She picked up the hammer, turned it over, found the blacksmith's stamp on the face of it. She hung it back on the peg. Then she went and sat in the doorway with her legs hanging over the ledge 200 feet above the canyon floor, with the canyon walls going gold in the evening light. And she thought about what she was going to do. She could go back to town, file the deed, let people see what she'd found. Let the story spread. Let the speculators come with their offers and their money and their perfectly reasonable arguments for why she should sell, or she could stay. The second option was harder, much harder. She had maybe 2 weeks of food in those canisters if she was careful, a limited set of tools, and a list of work that would take months. She had a 20-year-old horse with one good eye and bad joints. She had hands that were already blistered from 3 days of work, and a back that ached every morning before she even stood up. She also had 2 springs, a blueprint 12 years in the making, and a father's certainty she hadn't known she possessed until approximately 6 hours ago. She looked at the canyon below, at the dry creek bed that became a raging flood channel during monsoon season. At the places where the soil was darker, the sediment her father had written about, the mineral-rich deposits that ran in strips through the canyon floor like the grain in a piece of wood. She thought about corn growing against Red Canyon walls. She thought about Harlan's face when she'd told him she was leaving. She made her decision. She went back inside, found the oilskin that had covered the tin box and spread it out on the sleeping shelf for a bit of extra cushioning. She ate sparingly from the food her father had stored: beans, a small portion of dried apple, and drank water from the stone basin. Most of its windows were dark. Then she pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders and opened the journal to the section on irrigation and read until the light from the window was gone entirely, and she was reading by feel in the dark. She started work the next morning before the sun reached the canyon floor. She went down and brought Copper up to a wider section of the ledge she'd identified during her reading her father. Had noted it in the journal, had even built a simple rope tether system into the rock there, though the rope had long since rotted and would need replacing. She used the good rope from the cache below and rigged a new tether. It wasn't comfortable quarters for a horse, but it was shaded and out of the wind, and Copper was an old hand at making do. She spent the first full day finishing the clearance of the stone path. She worked top to bottom this time, moving debris off the steps and over the cliff edge where it wouldn't clog anything, reinforcing 2 steps that had loosened over the years with wedges of broken rock packed tight around the base. The second day, she went to the canyon floor and began working on what her father's journal called the primary clearance, the long section of canyon floor between the cliff base and the canyon entrance where the soil was best. The mesquite here was old and deep-rooted, and it did not come out without a fight. She worked with the pickaxe and her body weight, and a technique she'd developed on the second day that involved scoring around the root system first, before trying to lever it free, which was slower, but worked without destroying her back. By the end of the second day, she had a stretch of cleared ground, about 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, and she was so tired she could barely climb back up to the cliff house. She ate. She drank water. She read a few more pages of the journal. She slept like something dead. She woke up and did it again. This became the shape of her days. Work until the heat of noon made it genuinely dangerous. Rest through the worst of the afternoon in the cool of the cliff house. Work again in the late afternoon until the light failed. Climb, eat, read the journal, sleep, start again. Her hands hardened. The blisters broke and healed and hardened into calluses. The ache in her knees was still there. It was always going to be there. She'd accepted that, but it became background noise rather than the loudest thing in the room. She got faster on the stone steps as her body learned them, as her feet found the rhythm of them without her having to think about where to place each step. She didn't see another person for 11 days. That was not, she found, the hardship she'd expected it to be. She'd spent most of her life surrounded by people and often felt lonelier than she did here. Loneliness was about not being seen. You could be invisible in a house full of people. She'd proven that repeatedly. Out here in this canyon, she was the only one who had to see herself, and she found that was enough. On the 12th day, a sound drifted into the canyon from the direction of the entrance. Not an animal sound, not wind. Voices. She set down the pickaxe. She stood very still and listened. 2 voices, she thought. Both men. They were at the canyon entrance, maybe, or just outside it. She couldn't make out words from here. Just the cadence of conversation, one voice lower and one higher, and then a sound that was unmistakably Harlan's laugh. Something cold moved through her chest. She picked up the pickaxe and walked toward the canyon entrance without hurrying, because hurrying would make her look frightened. And she had decided somewhere in the last 12 days that she was done performing fear for people who had no right to it. She came around the bend and found them 30 feet from the canyon entrance, both on horseback, Harlan on his big gray, Bram on the roan he'd been riding for 6 years. They saw her at almost the same moment she saw them, and Harlan pulled up short, and something crossed his face that she recognized after a second as surprise, genuine surprise, which meant he'd expected to find her gone. "Lenora," he said. "Harlan," she said. "Bram." Bram at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. He was younger than Harlan by 4 years, and smarter in several ways, but had never once in his life figured out how to disagree with Harlan when Harlan had already made up his mind about something. "We heard in town you were still out here," Harlan said. He was looking past her at the canyon, not really at her. Figured you'd have come to your senses by now. I'm fine, thank you for asking, she said. That landed. Bram looked at his saddle horn. Harlan's jaw tightened slightly. There's no water out here, Harlan said. You know that, right? You've been out here almost 2 weeks with no There's water, Lenora said. Silence. Harlan looked at her then. Really looked at her. Maybe for the first time since they were children. At her sun-darkened face and her calloused hands and the pickaxe she was holding in a grip that was not aggressive but was also not casual. What do you mean there's water? He said. I mean there's water, she said. This is my property. You have the deed to the family ranch. I have the deed to Red Hollow. As far as I can tell, we don't have any more business with each other today. Harlan opened his mouth, closed it. Lenora, I'll be in town in a few weeks to register some documents at the land office, she said. If you need to speak with me about something that doesn't involve my property, you can find me there. She turned around and walked back into the canyon without waiting to see what he did next. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She walked until the bend in the canyon took her out of their line of sight. And then she stopped and leaned against the canyon wall and let herself shake for about 30 seconds, because her body had decided to do that, and she wasn't going to fight it. Then she picked up her pickaxe and went back to work. She didn't tell anyone about the spring. That was a decision she made sometime during the night after Harlan and Bram rode away, lying on the sleeping shelf in the cliff house, listening to the water move through its clay pipe into the stone basin, running the numbers in her head the way she'd always run numbers quietly, without anyone knowing she was doing it, because that was the only way she'd ever been allowed to think seriously about anything. If word got out that Red Hollow had a natural spring, the interest would come fast. It always did in this territory. Water was the only thing that mattered more than silver or cattle in the Arizona desert, and a man with access to water could set terms for the people who didn't have it. She'd watched her father do it. She'd watched neighboring ranchers do it, the deals they struck and the debts those deals created. Water made people generous, and water made people ruthless, and the line between those two things was thinner than most people wanted to admit. She was not ready to have that conversation yet. Not until she understood what she actually had. So she kept working. She'd been in Red Hollow for 3 weeks when the first real problem announced itself, which was that her food supply was running low in ways that couldn't be stretched much further. She'd been careful with the canisters her father had stored, had eaten less than she probably should have on several days, which her body informed her about each morning with a specific kind of hollow ache. But careful only goes so far, and the cornmeal was almost gone, and the beans were down to what she could cup in 2 hands. She needed to go to town. She didn't want to go to town. The town was 30 miles north, which was closer than the ranch had been, but still most of a day's ride on copper. At the pace the old horse could manage comfortably. Most of its windows were dark, which meant at least one night away from Red Hollow, which meant leaving everything she'd found here unattended, and even though she'd told herself that Harlan and Bram had no legal claim to anything in this canyon, she wasn't naive enough to think that legal claims were what stood between her and whatever her brothers decided to do if she wasn't here to stop them. But she didn't have a choice. She packed what she needed, loaded copper, and left before dawn. She brought the tin box with her deed and her father's note. She left the journal in the cliff house, hidden behind the loose stone she'd found in the back wall on her 4th day, a natural gap in the rock that her father had apparently used as a secondary storage spot, filled with extra candles, and a second coil of rope, and a small folding knife that still held an edge. The ride north was dull. In the wide north was long desert rides were not unpleasant, just empty, the kind of emptiness that gave your mind too much room to move around in. She thought about the journal entries she'd read. She thought about the irrigation channel she'd been planning based on her father's maps. She thought up the cleared section of canyon floor where the soil was darkest, where the monsoons and sediment had been building up for years. She thought about corn. She'd been thinking about corn a lot, about whether it was practical, about how long a growing season she realistically had, about what she'd need beyond seed and water and ground. She stopped thinking about corn when the outskirts of Crail came into view. Crail was not a large town. It had a main street with the essentials, a general store, a livery, a land office, a saloon, a doctor's office that was open 3 days a week, when the doctor wasn't somewhere else. It had maybe 300 people, if you counted the ranching families who came in and the miners who drifted through when the season was right. It was the kind of town where everyone's business was more or less public knowledge, and where a woman riding in alone on a 20-year-old horse would be noted and discussed. She rode in without hurrying and tied copper at the post in front of the general store. She felt the looks before she saw them. That was something she'd learned to do very young, read the weight of other people's attention. Feel it on her skin. It had never stopped being uncomfortable. She'd just gotten better at not letting it show. She went into the general store and bought what she needed: dried beans, cornmeal, coffee, salt, lard, a box of matches, and a spool of heavy thread for mending, which she badly needed. The owner, a heavy-set man named Depper, who'd run the store for 20 years and had sold supplies to her father for most of that time, looked at her purchases and then looked at her and then looked at her purchases again. "You riding back south today?" he asked. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll camp tonight. Heard your brothers were out that direction a few weeks back." "They were," she said. She waited to see if he'd say anything else. He didn't, which she appreciated. She counted out her money, which she'd taken from the small reserve her father had left in an envelope tucked into the back of the journal. Not much, but enough for this run and maybe one more. She loaded the supplies into her saddlebags, gave Copper water at the trough outside, and was thinking about where to make camp when she heard her name. She turned. The man coming toward her was about her age, maybe a year or two younger, with the kind of lean, not thin build that came from physical work rather than deprivation. He was carrying a leather case of the type surveyors used, and he had a folded set of maps under one arm and ink stains on his right hand that went up past the wrist. "Lenora Veyne?" he said again, stopping a few feet away. "Yes," she said. "Alden Crowther." He shifted the map case and offered his hand, and she shook it, which he seemed to appreciate. Some men got thrown off when a woman shook hands directly, acted like she'd done something unexpected or vaguely alarming. He just shook it. "I'm with the Territorial Surveying Office. I've been assigned to the Southern Canyon District. Your property is on my list." She looked at him steadily. Red Hollow, he confirmed. "I need to do a formal survey and register the boundaries. I was going to send a letter to your family's ranch. I live at Red Hollow," she said. "Have for almost a month." That landed on him the way it landed on most people, a brief recalibration. Something moving behind his eyes while he updated whatever picture he'd had. He managed it without making it awkward, which went into the column she was starting to keep on him. "All right," he said. "I was planning to ride out to the Southern District next week. Would that be convenient?" She thought about her unfinished clearance work, her half-planned irrigation channel, her carefully maintained privacy. She thought about the legal questions. Her father's journal had not quite answered questions about boundaries, about the extent of what the deed actually covered, about whether the spring and its water rights were as clearly hers as she believed them to be. She needed those questions answered. She needed someone with official maps and official authority to look at her deed and tell her exactly what she owned. "Come on Wednesday," she said. "I'll be there." He nodded and wrote something in a small notebook he produced from his coat pocket. Wednesday. Red Hollow Canyon, Southern District. He looked up. "Is there anything I should know before I ride out there? Terrain? Access issues?" "The entrance is narrow," she said. "Your horse will fit if you keep him straight. And it's rough going until you're inside. Bring enough water for 2 days in case anything delays you." "Appreciate the warning," he said. She nodded and went to untie Copper. "Miss Veyne," he said. She stopped. "For what it's worth, I've looked at the original deed filing for that property. Whatever people say about it, the boundaries are extensive. Your father filed a claim that covers a significant piece of that canyon system." She turned and looked at him. He wasn't being kind in the way people were kind to her sometimes, the careful, slightly pitying kindness that was really about their own discomfort. He was giving her information, the way one professional gave another professional information. "Thank you," she said. Wednesday. She made camp that night 3 miles south of town, where a dry creek bed offered some windbreak, and a stand of Palo Verde trees gave Copper a little shade. She lay on her bedroll and looked up at a sky full of stars, and thought about what the surveyor had said. Extensive boundaries. She thought about her father's maps, about the notes in the margins of the irrigation section, where he'd written, matter-of-factly, about the second spring near the eastern wall, and then added a note she'd been puzzling over. There may be more. The geology suggests a connected system. Would need a survey to confirm. She fell asleep thinking about connected water systems and woke up thinking about connected water systems, which was probably not healthy, but was definitely useful. She was back in Red Hollow by early afternoon the next day. The canyon was exactly as she'd left it, which she'd expected, mostly, but still felt like something in her chest unknotting when she came around the last bend and saw the cleared stretch of ground, her tools where she'd left them at the base of the cliff, the stone path going up to the hidden door. Nobody had been here. She gave herself approximately 30 seconds to feel relieved about that, before she unsaddled Copper, stored the new supplies in the cliff house, and got back to work. She had 4 days until Wednesday. She wasn't going to waste them. The weather changed on Monday. She noticed it the way her father had taught her. To notice weather, not looking at the sky, which only told you what was already happening, but by paying attention to the animals and the air pressure and the particular quality of the wind. Copper was restless in a way that wasn't about feed or heat. The lizards disappeared. The air, which had been the usual dry Sonoran nothing, started carrying something underneath it, a wetness that hadn't been there before, a heaviness. She'd seen maybe 10 good Arizona monsoons in her life. She knew what they meant. She went up to the cliff house and spent the evening making the place as weather-ready. As she could manage checking the drainage pipe from the spring basin, clearing debris from the ledge outside the door, moving anything that could be ruined by water to the highest shelves. She brought Copper up to the ledge and retied him with extra rope at 2 anchor points instead of 1. He was not pleased about this arrangement. She gave him the last of the dried apple from the tin, and he accepted it with the energy of a horse registering a complaint, but acknowledging the inadequacy of available alternatives. Tuesday was the waiting kind of day. The clouds built from the south, enormous white towers in the morning that went gray and then dark through the afternoon. The wind dropped in the middle of the day in the way it always did before a big storm. That eerie desert stillness that meant something large was gathering its breath. Lenora climbed up to the cliff house and stayed there. The storm arrived at dusk. She had never in her life seen rain like this from inside the rock. That was the only way to describe it, being inside the rock while the world outside went sideways. The cliff house held. She'd had some abstract faith that it would, based on the evidence that her father had built it, and her father had not built things that didn't hold. But abstract faith and direct experience are different, and listening to the wind scream across the face of the cliff 200 feet above the canyon floor and feeling the mountain at her back hold absolutely still and solid was something she would remember for a long time. The lightning showed her the canyon floor below through the small glass window. It was flooding. Not slowly, not gradually, the canyon filled the way a trough fills when you open a full valve. The water coming down from somewhere higher up in the rock system and spreading fast and violent across the floor she'd spent weeks clearing. Stecky. Within 20 minutes of the storm's arrival, the canyon floor was a moving brown river, and within an hour it was chest-deep on anything that would have been standing in it. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched it, and thought about her cleared ground under all that water, and the tools she'd left at the base of the cliff this morning. She'd meant to bring them up before the storm hit and had run out of time, and the pickaxe and the 2 extra chisels were now probably somewhere in the flood, which was a loss she felt acutely and immediately couldn't do anything about. She noticed the riders when a lightning flash lit the canyon entrance. 2 horses, 2 riders, just inside the mouth of the canyon, pressed against the canyon wall where the cliff overhang gave them some protection from the rain. They were not moving. Whoever they were, they'd found the only dry-ish spot in the canyon that wasn't 200 feet up a cliff face. She watched through the next 3 or 4 flashes, trying to resolve dead details from distance and bad light and driving rain. On the 5th flash, she saw the gray horse, Harlan, and beside him, Bram's roan. Her brothers had ridden into Red Hollow during a monsoon and gotten themselves pinned against the canyon wall with their horses, and nowhere to go, and they were watching the flood with the particular body language of men who were realizing that the situation they'd ridden into was significantly worse than the situation they'd planned for. She sat back from the window and thought about this. They hadn't come in peace. She knew that without needing evidence. Harlan didn't do anything without a reason that served Harlan, and the only reason to come back to Red Hollow was the same reason he'd come the first time she'd said there was water, and now he wanted to understand what that meant for him. She could leave them there. The canyon wall overhang would keep them from drowning. Their horses were clearly still on their feet. They'd survive the night and ride out in the morning, and she'd deal with whatever came next when it came. She looked at the flood level in the next lightning flash. It was still rising. The alcove where they were sheltering was narrow, and the flood was moving fast. And the water was already within 3 feet of where their horses were standing, and if it rose another 2 feet, they were going to have to move, and there was nowhere in that canyon to move to except up, and there was only one way up. She made a decision she was not entirely happy about. She pulled on her coat and opened the cliff house door and went out onto the ledge in the storm. The wind was trying to take her off the side of the mountain. She kept one hand on the rock face and moved carefully, step by step, down the stone path, counting steps from memory because she couldn't see more than 4 feet in the driving rain. Most of its windows were dark. The rope she'd strung along the upper section of the path, her own addition, something her father's journal had mentioned doing, but which he apparently never got around to, was the only thing between her and a bad night. She made it to the bottom. The water was at her ankles at the base of the cliff, moving fast, already starting to lap at the lowest stone steps. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted toward the canyon entrance, into the storm. She had to do it 3 times, before the lightning showed her one of the riders turning his head. She waved both arms. The second rider grabbed the first one's arm and pointed. She watched them make the decision, watched Harlan, and it was Harlan, in front. She could tell by the way he held even himself in the dark and rain, look at the water rising around his horse's fetlocks, and then look up at her, and then look back at the water. They came. Getting 2 horses through rising floodwater to the base of a cliff, in the dark, in a monsoon, with a rope handrail and stone steps they'd never climbed before, was not a smooth operation. It was loud and frightening, and Harlan's gray slipped twice on the lower steps, and the second time went down on one knee, and Harlan had to dismount in ankle-deep, moving water to get the animal back on its feet, and Bram came up behind him with the roan, and his face had gone white under his hat brim. They got the horses to the wide ledge below the cliff house. Lenora had already run rope from the anchor points to give them 2 places to tie off. She helped with the knots, because Harlan's hands were shaking from cold, probably, and possibly from something that wasn't cold. Nobody said anything while they were doing this. It wasn't the time for conversation. When the horses were secured and her brothers were standing on the dry ledge with their backs against the rock face and the storms still howling below them, Harlan looked at her. "There's shelter up top," she said. "It's a climb, but it's safe. Follow me." She went up first and let them figure out the steps on their own. They managed it. Bram came up second and was actually pretty capable on the stone. He'd always been the more physical of the two, the one who'd done the fence work and the rough riding, while Harlan did the talking. Harlan came up last, slower, and didn't say anything. When he came through the door, just stood there, dripping on her father's stone floor and looking at the room around him. She gave them the spare blanket she'd found in the secondary storage alcove and a mug of coffee each, because the beans were already soaking and the coffee was what she had hot. The cliff house was crowded with 2 extra people in it, and she was acutely aware of that, of the reduced space, of the way their presence changed the quality of the air in a room that had been hers alone for a month. Bram sat on the workbench and wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the shelves and the tools and the window and didn't say much. Harlan stood. Harlan stood in the middle of the room and looked at everything, and Lenora could doing the calculations she'd done herself, square footage, ceiling height, the workmanship, the shelf construction, and then his eyes found the pipe in the corner and the water running down into the stone basin and stayed there. "That's a spring," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The storm outside was still loud enough that quiet was relative. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since my 3rd day," she said. He looked at her. "And you didn't say anything." "It's my property," she said. "I didn't need to say anything to anyone." His jaw tightened. She watched him decide what kind of conversation this was going to be, and then decide not to have it tonight. And she was either wisdom or exhaustion, and she didn't particularly care which. He looked around the room again. At the shelves. At the door her father had fitted into the rock. At the window that had flashed at her from the canyon floor and brought her here in the first place. Father built this, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. When? Over about 12 years, she said. He started when you and Bram were at the ranch running things. Harlan's expression did something complicated that she couldn't read cleanly, Bram said quietly. From the workbench. He never mentioned it. No, Lenora said. He didn't. The storm pressed against the walls of the mountain. The water trickled in its channel. The candle she'd lit threw shapes across the stone ceiling. Bram looked up at her. He left you something real, Lenora. I know, she said. Harlan set his mug down on the floor and went and sat in the corner near the door with his back against the stone. And he didn't say anything else that night, which was the most she'd ever gotten from him that felt like anything resembling respect. She took the sleeping shelf. Her brothers took the floor with the blanket between them. And that was how the three Veyne children spent the worst night of the Arizona monsoon season in a room their dead father had built with his own hands in a canyon everyone had called worthless, listening to the desert flood and drain and remake itself far below. She didn't sleep well. She didn't expect to. Sometime before dawn, the storm broke. She could tell by the change in the sound the storm's noise had a texture to it, a continuous roar underlaid by lower rumbles. And when it began to thin and stutter, she was aware of it even without opening her eyes. By the time the sky through the window had gone from black to gray, it was over. She got up and looked out at the canyon. The flood had receded as flash floods did. Fast and complete the water was gone, or almost, leaving behind a glistening deposit of wet sand and the kind of dark-soaked ground that her father's journal had described with the word potential. The walls were dripping. Her cleared ground was still there, reshaped a little by the force of the water, but mostly intact, and in the pale morning light she could see the exact lines where the mineral-rich sediment had settled. She heard Harlan stir behind her. She didn't turn around. You're going to stay here, he said. It was not phrased as a question. Yes, she said. And you're not going to sell the spring. No, she said. Another silence. What are you going to do with it, he asked. And for the first time since she was a child, she heard something in Harlan's voice that she hadn't expected to hear. Not anger, not strategy. Something closer to curiosity, genuine and unguarded, the question of a man who was looking at something he hadn't understood before, and was beginning, slowly and at real cost to his pride, to try. She looked out at the wet canyon floor, at the lines of rich, dark soil. I'm going to make it grow, she said. She heard him get to his feet. She heard him come to stand beside her at the window, and she didn't move over to give him more room, and she didn't move away from him, just stayed where she was. Most of its windows were dark, and together they looked out at the canyon their father had believed in before either of them had understood why. Harlan was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was smarter than I gave him credit for, and she wasn't entirely sure if he meant their father or her, and she decided she didn't need to ask. The sound came about an hour after dawn, not from inside the canyon, but from outside it, drifting over the canyon walls from the direction of the desert to the east. It took her a moment to identify it because she hadn't been expecting it, and the acoustics of the canyon changed sounds in odd ways. A horse, moving carefully, coming toward the entrance. She went to the doorway and looked down. A rider appeared at the canyon mouth, a single man on a bay horse, picking his way through the debris the flood had left outside the entrance, moving at a careful walk, leaning forward to check the ground ahead of the horse's feet. He had a leather case tied behind his saddle and maps rolled under one arm. Wednesday. She'd completely lost track of the days in the storm. Alden Crowther had ridden out from Crail to do his survey, apparently undeterred by the fact that the desert between here and town was still draining from one of the worst monsoon nights of the year. She put her fingers in her mouth and whistled, sharp and carrying the same whistle she'd used her whole life to call horses, and the rider's head came up, and he scanned the cliff face until he found her 200 feet above him on the ledge. She waved. He waved back. She looked over her shoulder into the cliff house, where Harlan was standing behind her, having moved to the doorway when he heard the whistle. "Who is that?" Harlan said. "The territorial surveyor," Lenora said. "He's here to formally register the property boundaries." She watched that land on her brother. The formal survey, the registered boundaries, the document that would make everything legal and official and beyond dispute in a way that even Harlan, with all his practiced certainty about how the world worked, would not be you around. You planned this, Harlan said, not angry, almost something else. I asked him to come Wednesday, she said. I didn't plan the flood. She went down the stone steps to meet Alden Crowther, leaving her brothers to make their own way down in their own time. And when she reached the canyon floor, she was already thinking about what questions to ask him first, and whether his maps covered the eastern section where the second spring was, and what exact extensive boundaries had meant when he said it to her outside the general store 3 days ago. There was a lot to find out. She intended to find out all of it. Alden Crowther was not what she'd expected a territorial surveyor to be. She'd met 2 others in her life, both older men, both with the particular brand of self-importance that came from holding official authority in a place where official authority was thin on the ground and therefore worth more than it deserved. They'd been the kind of men who talked at you rather than to you, who explained things slowly and with great patience to people. They'd already decided, didn't need the full picture. Alden was 28 years old and had ink stains that went up past his wrist and asked questions like he actually wanted the answers. He came through the canyon entrance on his bay horse, picking his way over the flood debris, with the careful attention of someone who understood that what he was looking at told him things. And when he reached her, he dismounted without ceremony and looked around the canyon with the specific kind of focus she recognized from her father, not taking in the scenery, but reading it. How high did it get? He asked. He meant the flood. Chest deep on a standing man in the main channel, she said. Maybe 4 feet in the deeper sections near the western wall. He looked at the waterline marks on the canyon walls, the dark stain of wet against dry stone, and nodded, like she'd confirmed something he'd been calculating. You were here through it? Up in the cliff house, she said. Yes. He looked up at the ledge 200 feet above them, and then looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite disbelief, but was adjacent to it. You built those steps, he asked. My father built them, she said. I cleared them. He processed this. She could see him filing it, the way detail-oriented people filed things, not just accepting information, but placing it somewhere it would connect to other information later. I'd like to see the cliff house, he said, if that's possible, for the survey. It's possible, she said, but first I want to see your maps. That was direct enough that he paused, and then he almost smiled, not quite, but something at the edge of his expression acknowledged that she'd said something unexpected in a way that he found, if not amusing, at least interesting. Fair enough, he said. She heard her brothers coming down the stone path behind her, the scrape of boots' toots on rock, Bram's low voice saying something to Harlan that she couldn't make out. She didn't turn around yet. She kept her eyes on Alden, who noticed the sound and glanced past her toward the cliff, and then brought his eyes back to her, with the question visible on his face. My brothers, she said. They were here for the storm. She said it in a tone that communicated clearly that this was not a situation that required further explanation, and he accepted this without pushing, which was another mark in the column she was keeping. Harlan and Bram came up behind her. Harlan had put himself back together in the way he always did. Whatever complicated feeling had been visible on his face last night in the cliff house was gone now, replaced by the familiar surface. He extended his hand to Alden with the smooth confidence of a man who had never in his life walked into a room and wondered if he belonged there. Harlan Veyne, he said. Edmund's son. This is my brother Bram. Alden shook both their hands. Alden Crowther, Territorial Surveying Office. You're from the Veyne Ranch north of here? That's right, Harlan said. The main ranch. We were just checking on our sister. He said it with the particular tone of an older brother, benevolent, proprietary. The suggestion of a man who had driven 50 miles out of concern rather than calculation. Lenora watched Alden's face. He had the kind of face that broadcast everything it noticed, but she caught the brief recalibration. He was aware that Harlan's framing and Lenora's silence were not quite telling the same story. I'm here to do the formal survey and boundary registration for Miss Veyne's property, Alden said, and there was nothing pointed in his voice, just the plain statement of fact. But the specificity of it, Miss Veyne's property, landed in the space between all 4 of them with a weight that everyone standing there could feel. Harlan's expression didn't change, but his hand, which had been resting easy at his side, closed briefly and then opened again. Of course, he said. They spread Alden's maps on a flat section of rock near the canyon wall, weighting the corners with stones, and Lenora leaned over them with the deed to Red Hollow in her hand and her father's compass in her pocket, and did not move aside to give her brothers a better view. The maps were good, better than she'd expected for this part of the territory. Most of the survey work in the southern district was old and approximate, done by men who'd done their measurements on horseback and been generous with the straight line. Alden's maps were newer, his own work, and they showed the canyon system in a level of detail that matched what she'd observed from inside it. He pointed to the boundary line he'd pulled from the original deed filing. It ran in a rough rectangle around the canyon, including, she saw immediately, not just the canyon floor but the canyon walls to their natural ridge, and extending 300 yards beyond the eastern end of the canyon. The eastern end, where the second spring was. She said nothing about that. She put her finger on the eastern extension of the boundary line and looked at it, and then looked at the corresponding section on the deed, and the language there was precise enough that she was satisfied. "This section here," she said, pointing to the eastern extension on the map. "What's the terrain like outside the boundary?" "Scrub flat," he said. "No notable water features on the public record." "Inside my boundary," she said. "What does your survey show?" He looked at the map, at the section she was pointing to. He looked at it for a moment longer than he needed to, if he didn't already know something about it. "There's a topographic feature that my preliminary mapping flagged," he said carefully. "A depression in the rock. Could be natural. Could indicate subsurface water." He paused. "I was planning to walk it today." She nodded. "We'll walk it together." Harlan said, from behind her left shoulder, "What kind of water are we talking about?" She turned and looked at her brother. "That's what we're going to find out," she said. "And when we find out, I'll tell you what I decide to do about it." The emphasis on "I" was not subtle. She didn't mean it to be. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without difficulty, because she'd had a month of mornings, waking up alone in a desert canyon to get her footing under her, and she had a better sense of what she was standing on than she'd had in a long time. He looked away first. Bram, who had been largely quiet all morning, said, "I'll get the horses water," and walked off toward where Copper was tied, which Lenora understood as him extracting himself from the immediate tension with the pragmatic grace of a man who'd had long practice at it. Alden spent the next 2 hours doing what surveyors did, which was mostly walking and measuring and writing things in his notebook, and occasionally asking her questions that were practical and specific, and treated her as someone who knew what she was talking about. She answered them the same way. They measured the canyon entrance, the length of the canyon floor, the height of the cliff walls at 3 points. He walked the western edge while she walked the eastern edge, and they met in the middle with their measurements and compared them. And his numbers and hers were close enough that he raised an eyebrow. "You've been doing your own measurements," he said. "My father's notes," she said. "He was thorough." He was, Alden agreed, looking down at the numbers. "These are better than most of what the official record has for this district." Harlan had drifted away during the survey work, which Lenora accepted with cautious relief. He was doing what Harlan did when he didn't have an immediate angle, observing, moving around the edges, taking inventory. She tracked him in her peripheral dark. She tracked him in her peripheral vision, the way she'd learned to track things she wasn't ready to directly confront, continuously but without appearing to. He found the cleared section of canyon floor. She saw the moment he recognized what it was, not just cleared ground, but prepared ground. The soil turned and leveled, and the irrigation trench she'd started to sketch in the lowest section. She watched him stand over it with his hands on his hips and look at it with the expression of a rancher looking at land that was being put to serious use. Then he looked at the western cliff face, at the seep of spring water. She'd run down through a secondary channel her father had started and she'd finished, and the way the water darkened the soil at the base of the cliff. She could see him adding it up. The spring, the cleared ground, the water channel, the canyon walls that blocked wind and held heat, the rich monsoon sediment her father had written about. She'd known the moment was coming. She'd known since she told him there was water, that the moment was coming when Harlan would look at the place and understand what it was worth. And the question was never whether he'd try to take it was what form the attempt would take. He walked back toward her while Alden was still writing in his notebook. "Lenora," he said, "I want to talk to you." "Go ahead," she said. He looked at Alden briefly. Alden did not look up from his notebook, which was either coincidence or tact, and Lenora suspected it was tact. "This place is worth more than we understood," Harlan said. He said we. She noticed, not I, the collaborative pronoun, the one that suggested shared interest. "I know what it's worth," she said. "Father's will wasn't fair," he said. She almost laughed. Almost. She kept her face steady and said, "Father's will was his to write. He left you something significant and left us without knowing it existed. He was building a case." She could hear the construction of it, the careful layering. "That affects what's fair." "Harlan," she said. "Stop." He stopped. "I know what you're doing," she said. "I've known what you were doing since before you left the ranch to come down here. I know what you saw when you looked at the cleared ground. I know what you're thinking right now about the spring in the soil and what this canyon could produce." She kept her voice level because she'd had years of practice keeping her voice level when she wanted to do something else with it. "What I have to tell you is that none of that changes anything. This property is mine. The spring is mine. The deed is clear, and when Alden finishes his survey today, it will be registered and on the official record in a way that will not be ambiguous to anyone." "I'm not trying to take your property," Harlan said. "Then what are you trying to do?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cliff face, at the window and the door 200 feet up, at the stone steps their father had cut over 12 years. "I'm trying to understand why he did it this way," he said. And there it was. Underneath the calculation and the territorial instinct and the habit of wanting more, that was the actual question. The thing that had been sitting in Harlan Veyne's chest since he'd walked through the cliff house door last night and seen the shelves and the tools and the spring and understood that their father had spent 12 years building something here that neither of his sons had known about. She understood the wound of it. She didn't particularly want to, but she did. "He knew you and Bram would have fought over it," she said. "And it would have ended up about power instead of about what it could be. That's what he wrote." Harlan looked at her. "He wrote about it?" "In the journal he left here," she said. "Yes." Another silence. "The kind that had weight. What else did he write?" Harlan said. She considered how much to give him. It was a genuine consideration, not a performance of one she'd spent enough of her life giving her brothers things they didn't give back, that the instinct was automatic, the pulling back, the measuring. But she thought about the journal entries where her father had written about his own failings, about being a coward, about the things he hadn't said and should have. "He wrote about all of us," she said, and not all of it was flattering, including things about himself. She looked at her brother. "Come back in a month if you want to read it. I'm not keeping you from it. But right now I have a survey to finish and a legal registration to complete, and I need you to let me do that without making it more complicated than it needs to be." Harlan looked at her for a long time. "A month," he said. "A month," she said. He nodded once, and that was that. The eastern end of the canyon took another hour to reach on foot, picking through the debris the flood had rearranged. Alden walked it methodically, checking his own maps against the terrain, making notes. Bram had rejoined them, trailing along with the quietly cooperative manner he adopted, when Harlan wasn't actively setting the tone of a situation. The topographic depression Alden had noted on his preliminary maps was a bowl-shaped section of rock near the canyon's eastern wall, maybe 20 feet across, where the sandstone had formed a natural basin over what Lenora could now see were a series of hairline cracks in the stone, running perpendicular to the canyon wall. She crouched at the edge of the basin. The stone was dark. Wet even now, hours after the storm, she pressed her palm flat against it. Cold, not flood cold, which faded quickly. The sustained cold of water moving through rock from somewhere deep. She looked up at Alden. He was already looking at her. "It's a subsurface emergence point," he said. "The water table here connects to the same system as your primary spring. The geology runs northeast from the cliff face. This is where it would surface if it had room to." "How much work to bring it to the surface?" she asked. "Not much," he said. "The crack system is already there. Your father's notes would probably tell you exactly what he was planning to do with it." He paused. "He knew about this?" "He suspected," she said. "He wrote that the geology suggested a connected system." Alden was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark, wet stone. "Miss Veyne," he said, "a connected spring system under this canyon, with the soil composition I'm seeing in the cleared section and the natural windbreak of these canyon walls. This property is significantly more valuable than it appears on any official record. She'd known this. She'd felt it. The way her father had felt it over 12 years of work and measurement and quiet planning. Most of it were dark, but hearing it, said out loud by someone whose profession was assessing the value of land in this territory, did something specific to the knowledge, made it official in a way that had its own weight. I know, she said. Harlan, standing 10 feet away, said nothing, but she heard him breathe out. They got back to the main section of the canyon in the late afternoon, and Alden set up near the flat rocks section to complete his paperwork while the light was still good. Lenora brought him coffee. She started a pot at the base of the cliff, using the small fire ring her father had indicated in the journal, and he thanked her without making it awkward, which was starting to feel like a reliable characteristic. She sat near him while he wrote, not looking over his shoulder but nearby, available if he had questions. Harlan and Bram were on the other side of the canyon, talking quietly to each other, and she let them have that space, because she was tired of managing her brother's responses to things, and because she'd said what needed to be said, and the rest was for them to process on their own time. Alden wrote for a while and then said, without looking up, "Your father filed the original claim 15 years ago." "I know," she said. The boundaries, he claimed, were specific in ways that most people filing in this district weren't, he said. Most people just described landmarks and let the office sort it out. He described geology, subsurface features. He used surveying terminology that most ranchers wouldn't have. She hadn't known that. She looked at him. He hired someone, she said. It wasn't a question, she was working it out as she said it. He had someone help him file it correctly. Someone who knew what they were doing, Alden confirmed. I looked at the original language before I wrote out. Whoever helped him file that claim made sure it covered not just the surface land, but the subsurface water rights, which in this territory is not the default. Most people lose their water rights to the first person who contests them because the original filing didn't specify. She sat with this for a moment. Her father had not just found the canyon and built the cliff house and left her a journal. He'd spent money on a proper legal filing that protected the water, had done it 15 years ago, when Lenora was 11 years old. When Red Hollow was just a dry canyon he'd stumbled into following a loose steer. He'd been planning this for 15 years. He was very thorough, she said. He was, Alden said. He glanced up from his notebook and looked at her briefly, and there was something in the look that was more than professional. So are you, from what I've seen today. She didn't know quite what to do with that, so she did what she usually did with compliments from men, which was absorb them without acknowledging them, and looked out at the canyon instead. The problem with Harlan announced itself the next morning. He came to her before breakfast, before she'd had coffee, which was either a tactical decision to catch her before she was fully alert, or just the particular thoughtlessness of a man who'd always had someone else up before him, making the morning happen. She was crouched at the base of the dark. She checking the lower drainage on the secondary water channel, and he came and stood over her, the way he stood over everything. I want to make you a proposal, he said. Good morning, she said. He paused. Good morning, he said. I want to make you a proposal. She straightened up. Her knees complained. She let them. I'm listening, she said. The ranch needs water, he said. Not this year, maybe, but in 3 years, 5 years, the west pasture well is dropping. You know that. You ran the numbers on the ranch accounts long enough to know exactly how we're situated. She did know. She'd been watching the west pasture well levels for 2 years before her father died, had mentioned it to him twice, and gotten the same response she always got when she brought up account concerns, a slow nod, and then nothing changing. You want access to the spring, she said. I want a water agreement, he said. Formal. Paid. Your terms. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, with an expression she'd almost never seen on his face open to her judgment, genuinely uncertain of the outcome. Harlan was accustomed to setting terms, not accepting them. Why are you asking me instead of trying to contest the deed? She said. He was quiet for a beat. Because I watched you stand on that ledge in a monsoon and wave at 2 idiots who had no right to ask you for help, he said. And you did it anyway. He stopped. And because the surveyor made it fairly clear yesterday that your claim is airtight, and I'm not stupid enough to spend money on a legal challenge, I won't win. Both of those things were true, and she appreciated that he offered both of them, instead of just the flattering one. I'll think about it, she said. I'm not saying no, and I'm not saying yes. But you need to do something first. What? He said. Go back to town, she said. Both of you. Let me finish the registration process without you here complicating it. If its windows were dark, when everything is official and on the record and there's nothing to contest, then come back and we'll talk about a water agreement. Formal. Written. My terms, as you said. He thought about this. That's fair, he said. I know it is, she said. They left after breakfast. Bram clasped her hand before, which was more than he'd ever mounted, than he'd ever done before, and she accepted it without making it significant, even though it was, a little. Harlan passed her without stopping, and then pulled up a few feet away and turned in the saddle. Lenora, he said. She waited. I shouldn't have said what I said at the lawyer's office, he said. About nobody wanting you. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that. It didn't give her back what it had taken from her when he said it, but it wasn't nothing. No, she said. You shouldn't have. He held her gaze for a moment and then turned his horse and rode out. She stood in the canyon entrance and watched them go, and then went back to the cliff house and sat down for approximately 5 minutes of just sitting, which she almost never allowed herself, but which she decided she'd earned. Then she went back to work. Alden finished the formal paperwork that same afternoon and spent another hour going over it, with her line by line, which she'd asked him to do, and which he did without any indication that he thought it was an unusual request or more thoroughness than the situation required. She read every word. She asked 4 questions, got 4 direct answers, and signed her name where he indicated. I'll file this in Crail at the end of the week, he said. Once it's registered, any challenge has to go through formal land court, and based on the strength of the original filing and the survey measurements, a challenge would need. He paused, looking for the right word. A miracle, she said. He almost smiled again. More or less, he said. Your father filed this claim in a way that makes it very difficult to contest in good faith. She looked at the signed documents in her hand. He was looking out for me, she said. Not to Alden, exactly, more just saying it out loud, the way you sometimes needed to hear your own voice say a thing before it settled into something you could carry without dropping. From a legal standpoint, yes, Alden said he was. He stayed one more night in the canyon, camping near the entrance rather than in the cliff house, which she appreciated. He didn't assume the invitation extended past professional necessity. She brought him supper anyway, the beans she'd made with the lard and the dried chiles she'd found in one of her father's sealed tins, and he ate it, without pretending it was better than it was, but also without complaint, which in her experience was a reasonable standard. The two was dark. They talked for a while in the early evening, sitting on rocks near the extinguished fire, not about property or water rights or surveys, but about other things. How long he'd been in the territory, what had brought him from Pennsylvania to the desert Southwest, what it was like to spend weeks at a time in the field, alone with maps and measurements, and no one to argue with about whether your numbers were right. I mostly argue with the numbers themselves, he said. And who wins, she asked. The numbers usually, he said, but I dispute the result for a while first. She found herself laughing, which surprised her. Not the fact of laughing, she laughed plenty, but the quality of it. How unguarded it was. How she wasn't doing the monitoring she usually did in conversations with men, the constant low-level tracking of whether she was taking up too much space or talking too much or asking questions that made her seem demanding. She noticed the absence of that monitoring the way you notice when a sound you've gotten so used to you stopped hearing it finally stops. She went up to the cliff house, and he went to his bedroll, and that was that. He came and found her before he left the next morning. I'll send word when the registration is complete, he said. Thank you, she said. He had his map cases in one hand and his bay horse's reins in the other. He looked at the canyon the way he'd been looking at it since he arrived, reading it, calculating. How long before you have crops in that ground, he said. If I start the second water channel this week and get seed in by the right date, 8 weeks to first planting. Whether anything actually grows depends on the season. He nodded. I'll be back through this district in 6 weeks, he said, for the neighboring parcels. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything else, and she didn't think they needed to. He rode out, and she turned back to the canyon, and the morning light was already moving fast across the walls. The way it did at this time of year, the shadow retreating up the stone as the sun climbed, and she had a water channel to finish and a second spring to think about, and beans, soaking for suppers and seeds to price the next time she went into town. She had more work than hours, same as always. The difference was that now she was doing it for something that was entirely and officially and irrevocably hers, and nobody in the Arizona territory could stand in front of her and say otherwise, and that changed the weight of the work in ways she was still discovering, day by day, as she moved through this canyon her father had believed in before she'd had the chance to believe in it herself. She picked up her tools and started on the channel. The ground was still wet from the monsoon, which actually made the digging easier, and she was grateful for small mercies even when they came wrapped in a storm she hadn't asked for, because that was generally how small mercies worked, in her experience inconveniently packaged, but real when you got to them. She worked until noon. She ate. She drank water from the spring. She went back to work. The second water channel took her 11 days. Not because it was beyond her capability, she'd understood the engineering of it from her father's notes well enough that the planning wasn't the hard part, but because the rock in the eastern section of the canyon was a different composition, the western wall, harder and more resistant, and her tools were not built for sustained channel work through solid stone. The chisel dulled on the third day. She spent an entire afternoon trying to re-edge it against a rough piece of sandstone, which was not the same as a proper whetstone, and got her about 60% of the way to useful. She worked with what she had. The days settled into their pattern. Up before light, coffee, an hour of journal reading or planning before the heat came, then work through the morning, rest through the worst of the afternoon in the cool of the cliff house, then back at it until the canyon went purple and the temperature dropped fast, the way it did in the desert. That sudden evening mercy that felt like the day apologizing for what it had put you through. She got the second spring open on a Thursday, or what she was fairly confident was a Thursday, her sense of the days of the week having become approximate at best. She'd been widening the hairline crack in the basin for 2 days with the chisel and a careful patience she hadn't known. She possessed until she needed it, and she was crouched over the work in the late morning when the resistance changed under the chisel tip, suddenly and completely, and water came up through the crack not as a seep but as a genuine upwelling, pressurized, cold, spreading across the basin floor in a thin across the basin silver sheet that caught the canyon light and made something in her chest do something complicated. She sat back on her heels and let it fill. It was smaller than the primary spring, maybe half the flow, but it was real, and it was cold, and it was hers. And combined with the primary spring, it was enough water to support serious agriculture in this canyon, enough to fill cisterns through the dry months, enough to share if she chose to. She did not in that moment feel triumphant in the way people imagine triumph felt. She felt tired and her knees hurt. Her hands had a new blister forming on the left palm where she'd been compensating for the dulled chisel. She felt like someone who had done a hard thing and now had to figure out what the next hard thing was. But underneath all of that, quiet and steady as the water coming up through the crack in the stone, there was something else. Something that had been building since the day she'd found her father's pickaxe in the sand, since she'd read his note for the first time in the cool of the cliff house, since she'd stood on the ledge in a monsoon and watched her brothers need her help. She was not who people said she was. She'd always suspected it. She'd spent years quietly proving it to herself in small ways, the accounts she corrected when nobody was looking, the animals she treated when nobody else thought to, the work she did at 3 a.m. because it needed to be done. And she was the one who noticed. But suspecting something about yourself and knowing it are different in the way that a map and a place are different. The map tells you what should be there. Walking, it tells you what is. She'd walked it now. This canyon was the proof of it, written in cleared ground and stone steps and a channel she'd cut through solid rock with a half-dulled chisel and her own stubbornness. She cupped her hands under the new spring and drank. The word from the land office came with a rider Alden had sent from Crail, a young man of about 17 who arrived at the canyon entrance on a spotted horse and looked extremely uncertain about whether he was in the right place until Lenora came out to meet him. He handed her the envelope with the solemnity of someone who understood, at least vaguely, that what he was carrying mattered. She opened it standing in the canyon entrance with the afternoon light behind her. The registration was complete. Red Hollow Canyon, its water rights, its subsurface spring system, its walls to the natural ridgeline, and the 300-yard eastern extension were officially and permanently on record in her name alone. The surveying office had noted, in the formal documentation, the presence of 2 confirmed spring emergence points and the geological evidence of a connected subsurface water system. Alden had written a brief personal note at the bottom of the official letter in his cramped, ink-stained handwriting. "This is a good piece of land, Miss Veyne. I hope you have many years in it." She folded the letter carefully and put it in the tin box with her deed and her father's note. She paid the young writer 2 bits for his trouble and sent him back north with her thanks. Most of its windows were dark. Then she stood alone in the canyon that belonged to her and let herself feel it fully, for the first time, not the anxious, careful version of belief she'd been maintaining for months, the kind you hold tightly because you're afraid to grip it too firmly in case it turns out not to be real. The full version. The settled, rooted, nobody can take this version. It felt less dramatic than she'd expected. It felt like ground under her feet. That was enough. The first crop went in 6 weeks after the registration. She'd ridden into Crail twice more. In that period, once for seed, once for additional supplies, and the new chisel she'd badly needed, and both times she'd walked through that town differently than she had the first time. Not because anything about her had changed in ways that were visible. She was the same large-bodied woman on the same old horse with the same calloused hands and the same particular way of looking at people that she'd always had. That direct look that some people found uncomfortable. But something inside the look had changed. And people are remarkably good at sensing that kind of change, even when they can't name what they're responding to. Depper at the general store talked to her differently. Not dramatically. She wouldn't have trusted a dramatic change, would have found it suspect. Just the small difference of a man treating another person as someone whose time and intelligence he respected. He asked about the land, asked practical questions about soil and seed timing, and when she answered, he listened to the answers rather than waiting out the space between his questions. A woman named Ida Parson, who ran Sumisin, who ran the laundry on the north end of town, and who had been one of the kinder faces at Canalzo at the lawyer's office on the day of the will, reading the kind that was genuine, even when it came with pity, stopped her on the street to ask how she was managing out there. She asked the question, the way women who have done hard things themselves ask each other about hard things. Not with the lifted chin of condescension, but with the level gaze of recognition. "Well enough," Lenora told her. "I heard you found water," Ida said. "I found what my father left me," Lenora said. Ida thought about this for a moment and then nodded, and that nod held something in it that a longer conversation would have cheapened, so Lenora let it be a nod and moved on. The first planting was beans and squash and a short row of corn she'd almost talked herself out of on practical grounds and then planted anyway because she'd been thinking about corn since before she'd even reached the canyon. And at some point, you had to stop negotiating with yourself and just put the seed in the ground. The soil was everything her father's notes had promised. Dark and mineral-rich, the monsoon sediment layered over decades into something that the worn-out grassland soil of the ranch country to the north couldn't touch. She irrigated from the secondary channel she'd cut from the primary spring, the water running down through carved stone gutters her father had planned, and she had finished, spreading through the cleared ground in the careful pattern she'd worked out from his irrigation diagrams and her own observation of how the water moved. Things grew. Not dramatically, not all at once, not without setbacks. The first week she lost a quarter of the bean row to something small and determined that she eventually identified as ground squirrels, which required her to spend 3 days building a barrier system that was less elegant than she'd hoped and more effective than she'd expected. The corn came up slow. 2 of the squash plants didn't make it past the first week, and she never quite figured out why, which bothered her in the specific way that mysteries without resolutions bother careful people. But things grew, genuinely and demonstrably grew, against Red Canyon walls in ground that 6 months ago had been buried under mesquite root and packed dirt, and everyone's certainty that nothing useful would ever come of this place. She was in the canyon when Alden came back. She'd half expected him not to. 6 weeks was what he'd said, 6 weeks for the neighboring parcels, but surveyors' schedules were at the mercy of terrain and weather, and the particular complications of remote desert work, and she'd told herself not to hold the timeline as a promise, because it hadn't been offered as one. He came on a Tuesday, in the early morning, before the heat arrived, and she heard his bay horse picking through the canyon entrance and recognized the footfall before she saw him, which surprised her. She hadn't realized she'd cataloged the specific rhythm of that horse on rocky ground. She was on her knees, at the edge of the bean row, working out a section of route she'd missed on the original clearing, when he appeared around the bend. He stopped when he saw her. She stayed where she was. "The beans are in," he said. "6 weeks ago," she said. He dismounted and led his horse toward the water trough she'd built, near the cliff base, a simple stone construction, fed by a secondary line from the lower channel, just deep enough to be useful. The horse drank. Alden looked at the rows of growing things, and the irrigation channels, and the cleared terracing she'd started working on the upper section of the canyon floor. "You've been busy," he said. "I have been," she said. He looked at the terracing. She watched him see what it was, not just cleared ground, but a design, a system, a plan for how this canyon was going to be used over years, not just the current season. "How much of this was your father's plan, and how much is yours?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "The bones are his," she said. "The rest is mine." He nodded like that was the answer he'd been expecting. He stayed 3 days that time. He had genuine work to do, the parcels to the east of her boundary required fieldwork that took him out of the canyon each morning. But he came back each evening, and they ate supper together, and they talked about the land and the water and the geology of the spring system, which he found genuinely interesting in the way people who are good at their work find the interesting parts of other people's work interesting. About her father's journal, which she let him read a section of on the second evening, not the personal entries, not the ones about the family, but the technical sections, the irrigation notes, and the geological observations. And he read it with the same focused attention he gave his own maps. "Your father should have been a surveyor," he said, handing it back. "He would have said surveyors should be ranchers," she said. Alden considered this. "Probably both right," he said. On the third evening, he said, "I'm going to be based in Crail through the winter. The district office is expanding the survey coverage for this whole southern section." She looked at him up across the small farm they'd built at the canyon base. "That's a long assignment," she said. "It's a big district," he said. She understood what he was saying, and he understood that she understood it, and neither of them made it more complicated than it needed to be right then, which was either wisdom or cowardice, and she was prepared to call it wisdom for the time being. Harlan came back at the end of summer, as he'd said he would. He came alone this time, without Bram, which she read correctly as an acknowledgement that this was a conversation needed to have without a witness who would remember every word of it. She respected that, even though she didn't particularly say so. They sat on rocks in the canyon and drank coffee, and she let him look at what she'd built, the bean rows, now bearing actual beans, the squash spreading across the lower terrace, the corn at knee height and climbing, before they talked about anything important. "This is real," he said. He didn't mean just the crops. "I know," she said. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the irrigation channel running along the canyon wall. "The west pasture well dropped another 8 inches this summer," he said. "I know," she said again. "I'd been watching it for 2 years before Father died." He looked at her. "You told him?" "Twice," she said. A muscle in his jaw moved. "He didn't tell me," she said. She let him sit with that. It was his to sit with, not hers to manage. "I want to work out a water agreement," he said after a while. "What are your terms?" She'd been thinking about terms since the morning he'd first used the word. She'd written several versions of them in the margins of her father's journal, drafted and reconsidered, thought about what was fair and what was sustainable and what left her with enough control that the agreement served her rather than constraining her. "Drought conditions only," she said. "I don't supply water during normal seasons. Your well serves you until it can't. When there's a declared drought, or your well drops below a functional level that you can document and show me, not just tell me you can purchase water from the canyon at a rate we agree on now and put in writing." She paused. "The rate adjusts every 3 years. I set the adjustment based on my costs and my own needs. If Red Hollow has a bad season, the agreement pauses. And I have no ownership claim," he said. "You have no ownership claim," she confirmed. "You have a water purchase agreement, same as I'd give any neighboring ranch." He was quiet for a moment. "Any neighboring ranch," he repeated. "Yes," she said. "You're not a special case, Harlan. You're a neighbor. That's what I can offer you." It It was the hardest thing she said to him, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. For most of their lives, she'd been in the position of needing things from him, or appearing to the family connection, the shelter of the family name, the right to exist in the space the family occupied. She'd navigated that dependency with a kind of practiced invisibility, making herself useful and undemanding and easy to overlook. She was not in that position anymore. He wasn't her brother in the sense of having any claim on her. He was a rancher with a water problem, and she had water, and what she was offering him was fair, and nothing more. "All right," he said. They wrote it out that afternoon, both of them working on the language, going back and forth on wording in the pragmatic way of two people who'd grown up in the same house and understood how the other person thought even when they didn't agree. It took 2 hours. Lenora copied it out twice in her clearest handwriting, both copies signed by both of them, one for each. When they were done, Harlan rolled his copy and tucked it into his coat and looked around the canyon one more time. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "Did you know, when you left the ranch, did you already suspect what was out here?" She thought about the morning. She'd sat on the edge of her bed before dawn, looking at the blue curtain she'd sewn herself. About the deed spread flat on the kitchen table. About the particular expression on her father's face that she'd spent years trying to name and hadn't had words for until she read the journal. "I knew Father didn't do things without reasons," she said. "I didn't know what the reason was, but I knew there was one." Harlan nodded slowly. "You trusted him more than I did," he said. "I had less to lose by trusting him," she said. "That's not the same as being braver." He looked at her. It was the look from the Cliff House doorway, the one she'd seen on his face when he'd stood over the stone basin and watched the spring water trickle, in not quite an apology, not quite an admission, but something that lived near both of them. "I'm sorry I said what I said at the lawyer's office," he said. "I said it before and I'm saying it again, because once wasn't enough." She held his gaze. "I know you are," she said. He left before sundown. She watched him ride out of the canyon entrance, his back straight and his gray horse moving at the easy lope, that neck-covered ground, without hurrying. And she felt something loosen that she hadn't realized was still tight. Not forgiveness in the clean, resolved way that stories sometimes promised. It wasn't that simple, and she didn't insult either of them by pretending it was. Years of a thing leave marks that an apology doesn't erase, not fully, not quickly. But the account between them was more balanced than it had ever been, and that was real. She was willing to let that be enough for now and see what it became over time. That winter she came down from the Cliff House. Not permanently, the Cliff House remained the heart of the property, the place where she slept and cooked and kept her father's journal and her own expanding set of notes. But she'd spent the late building a small structure at the canyon floor near the primary irrigation channel, using the skills she'd inherited from a father who'd taught her by letting her watch rather than by sitting her down and explaining, which was maybe not the most efficient teaching method, but had apparently worked. It wasn't much to look at. Stone walls, timber roof, a single room with a fireplace she was cautiously proud of, and a window facing east so the morning light came in first. But most of it solid were dark, and it was dry, and it meant she didn't have to climb 200 feet every time she wanted to check the irrigation channels in the middle of the night, which was a practical consideration that anyone who'd made that climb in the dark could appreciate. Alden helped with the roof beams. He'd been riding out from Crail every few weeks through the fall, never staying more than a few days, always with legitimate surveying work to account for the direction he was traveling, and she'd stopped pretending to herself that the surveying work was the primary reason. He was careful with her. That was the word she kept coming back to, not careful in the way of someone walking on uncertain ground, but careful in the way of someone paying attention, noticing the shape of things, working to understand rather than assuming. He asked before he offered opinions. He didn't try to fix things she hadn't asked him to fix. He noticed when she went quiet in a particular way and gave her the quiet rather than talking into it. He was not a perfect person. He was sometimes impatient with things he thought should be simpler than they were. He had strong opinions about the correct way to do certain kinds of structural work that occasionally conflicted with her equally strong opinions, and they'd had two genuinely sharp disagreements about the placement of the roof supports that had resulted in neither of them had thought of originally, which she privately found satisfying. He was honest. He was curious. He worked hard and didn't make a show of it. That was enough to build on. He asked her at the end of the winter, in the cliff house on an evening when the canyon below them was dark, and the stars between the walls were very bright, and Copper was sleeping on the wide ledge outside with the particular utter unconsciousness of an old horse in a warm spot. He didn't ask with ceremony. He wasn't that kind of person. He just said, "I've been thinking about whether to take the district office's offer of a permanent posting here." And then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'd like to know if that matters to you. Whether I'm here." She thought about it. She gave it real thought rather than the reflexive response, and he was patient enough to wait. She thought up that the version of herself that had ridden into this canyon on a half-blind horse with 2 canteens of water and blistered heels and the particular kind of desperate hopefulness that doesn't quite know it's hoping. About how that woman had not needed saving. About how what had happened to her since had not been a rescue, but a revelation of what she was capable of, what she'd always been capable of, what her father had seen in her when he'd built a 12-year plan on the foundation of his confidence in her. She didn't need Alden Crowther to be whole. She'd established that beyond any reasonable doubt. But needing someone and wanting someone were not the same thing, and she was 30 years old. And she'd spent enough time alone to know the difference between solitude chosen and solitude as default, and what she felt when he was here versus what she felt when he wasn't here was clear enough data that she didn't see the point in pretending otherwise. "Take the posting," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said, "directly this time. It matters." He nodded. Nothing more dramatic than that. But he reached across and put his hand over hers on the journal she'd been reading, and she turned her hand over, and they sat like that for a while in the cliff house her father had built, listening to the spring run through its clay pipe into the stone basin, that small, steady sound that had been there through all of it, through every hard morning and every longer night, patient and indifferent, and absolutely real. They married in the spring, not in a church and not with much ceremony, because neither of them wanted much ceremony, just the justice of the peace in Crail and Bram as a witness on Lenora's side, and a friend of Alden's from the surveying office on his, and dinner afterward at the place, across from the general store, that did a reasonable beef stew. Ida Parson came into the restaurant and stopped at their table and looked at Lenora with that level gaze that recognized one hard thing from the position of having done a few hard things herself. "Good," she said, just that word, and went to her own table. Lenora and Alden built their life in Red Hollow the way you build anything worth having, not in a single season, not without setbacks, not without arguments about the correct placement of things and the correct sequence of things, and occasionally about whose turn it was to notice that something needed to be done. The second year, the corn did well. Better than well, the combination of the mineral soil and the controlled irrigation, and what Lenora could only describe as the canyon's particular relationship with sunlight. The way the walls concentrated in certain directions at certain hours produced ears that were larger than anything she'd grown before, and that she was frankly unreasonably pleased about. She started the terrace system in earnest that second year, extending the cleared and irrigated ground up its natural slope in shallow steps that followed the contour of the rock and held the soil against the force of the monsoon floods. It was slow work and ongoing work, the kind of project that didn't have a completion date, but had visible progress, which was its own reward. The third year, a neighboring rancher named Gus Fleece came to her about water. Not Harlan's drought agreement that was separate, documented, filed at the land office. This was Gus Fleece, whose ranch sat 8 miles northeast, and whose single well had been declining for 3 years, and whose cattle were starting to show it. He came with his hat in his hands, and the particular manner of a man who was not accustomed to asking and found it difficult. She worked out terms with him, different terms than Harlan's, adjusted for the different situation, but fair ones, the same way she'd told Harlan he was a neighbor, not a special case, and what she could offer was water at a fair price during documented hardship, and the terms gave her control and gave him access and put everything in writing. She did the same thing twice more in the following 2 years, as the dry season in the territory extended, and the ranches around Red Hollow felt it, and by the 5th year, she had 4 formal water agreements filed at the land office, and a small but real income from them, that she put directly into seed and tools in the second cistern she'd been planning. since she read her father's notes about water storage. It was not a wealthy life, not by the standards of people who measured wealth in bank counts and cattle counts. But it was a life that belonged entirely to her, structured according to her own judgment. Most of its windows were dark, built on her own labor and her father's foresight and the particular stubbornness she'd to feel ashamed of and had since come to understand as one of the better things about herself. Alden's surveying work took him out of the canyon for days at a time, sometimes weeks. She didn't resent this. She understood work that required being somewhere specific, and she had enough of her own to fill the time. And the coming back was its own quality of good that she'd learned to value without taking for granted. They had disagreements that were real disagreements, not the performative kind, about money and priorities and the right time to take on a new project and whether the additional water agreement with the fleece ranch would overextend the spring system. She was right about some of these and wrong about some of these, and Alden was right about some and wrong about some, and they worked it out. The way people who respect each other work things out, not always smoothly, not always quietly, but honestly and without the accumulated grudges that come from not saying things. Her body was her body. It didn't change to accommodate anyone's preferences, including her own, in the ways she sometimes wished it would. Her knees remained a fact of every morning. Her back remained something she managed rather than forgot about. She was large in a landscape that rewarded the lean and the quick, and she was lower than she might have been, and needed to rest in the heat of the day in ways that a different body might not. She'd made her peace with it the way you make peace with things that are not going to change, not by pretending they were fine when they weren't, not by constant complaint, but by building a life that worked with the reality of them rather than against it. The Cliff House steps that were hard in the beginning were simply part of her day now. The work of its windows were done in the cool of morning, and the cool of evening got done. The work that couldn't wait through the noon heat got done harder. She knew her limits, and she knew the difference between her limits and other people's assumptions about her limits, and she'd gotten very good at that distinction. On a late afternoon in the 5th year, she was standing on the terrace ledge above the canyon floor when she heard Copper make his particular sound, not a whinny, something lower, the sound he made when he wanted her to know he was aware of something. She looked down. A woman was standing at the canyon entrance. Young, maybe 20, maybe a little older, with a horse that had clearly come a long way and that suggested she'd packed for a longer trip than she'd yet made. She was standing just inside the entrance with her hand on her horse's neck, looking up at the canyon walls with an expression Lenora recognized from the inside. Someone's standing at the edge of something they'd decided to do before they fully understood what it would cost them. She came down from the terrace and walked toward the entrance. The young woman heard her coming and turned. Her face had the kind of set to it that came from holding it steady for a long time, the specific firmness of someone who was not going to cry in front of a stranger, even if they'd been crying an hour ago. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said. "I heard in Crail there was a woman out here who I wasn't sure what I was going to say when I got here." Lenora looked at her, at the saddlebag, at the horse that had covered real distance, at the hands that were gripping the reins too tightly for a horse that was standing still. "Come in," Lenora said. "I'll put on coffee." The young woman blinked. "Just like that?" "You rode here," Lenora said. "You might as well have something to drink." She turned and walked back into the canyon, and after a moment, she heard the young woman bring her horse through the entrance and follow. Her name was Clara Hess, and she was 22 years old, and she'd left a situation in Tucson that she's described in careful, abbreviated terms that Lenora didn't push at, because some things got told in their own time, and some things never got told at all, and neither was wrong. What she'd come looking for, she said haltingly, was work. Real work. The kind where what you did mattered. Lenora poured coffee into 2 cups and slid one across the flat rock she'd been using as a work table near the lower spring, and she thought about a 26-year-old woman sitting on the edge of a bed in the dark looking at a blue curtain, and she thought about a pickaxe with a blacksmith's stamp half covered in sand, and she thought about what it meant to have someone show you that you were capable of more than the world had told you. "Can you work in heat?" she said. Clara looked at her. "Yes." "Can you learn something you've never done before?" "Yes." "I can't pay much," Lenora said. "Not yet." But there's a room in the lower building, and the food is plain and honest, and the work is real. I can promise you the work is real. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. What kind of work? Lenora looked out at the canyon, at the terraced ground, and the irrigation channels, and the corn growing against red walls, and the two springs running quiet and steady from the rock. The kind that makes something out of what other people said was nothing, she said. Clara was quiet for a long moment. When do I start? She said. Soon as you've finished your coffee, Lenora said. That was the thing about Red Hollow that she'd never been able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't stood in it and felt it. It was not a place that announced itself. It didn't have the grand sweep of the open range or the obvious drama of the mountain country to the north. It was narrow and it was hard, and it had taken everything she had to give and then asked for more. But it was hers. Not in the small, defended way of things you clutch because you're afraid of losing them. In the open-handed way of things you've actually earned, that are yours because you made them what they are, that couldn't be taken by any legal challenge or anyone's opinion, or the accumulated weight of everything people had ever said about who you were and what you deserved. Her father had known something she'd needed 12 years to learn for herself, which was that the right piece of ground given to the right person wasn't charity or consolation or the bottom of the barrel after the better things were distributed. It was a different kind of gift, the kind that required the recipient to become fully themselves in order to receive it, the kind that was useless to anyone who wasn't ready for it. She'd been ready. She hadn't known she was, but she'd been ready. The sun dropped below the canyon walls on a September evening in the 5th year, and the light went that particular shade of crimson and deep gold that happened here. And only here, at this hour, in this place the way the red stone caught the last of the day and held it longer than the open desert did, so that the canyon was still burning with color when the sky above it had already gone to purple. She stood on the upper terrace, with her hands loose at her sides and her knees aching in the familiar way, and the sound of Alden working on something below something, with wood and a hammer, some project he'd been planning for 2 weeks, and had finally gotten materials for rising up through the warm air. Clara was at the lower spring checking the evening flow level, which was now part of the daily routine, and which she'd taken to with the methodical attention of someone who'd found work that actually meant something to her. Copper was on the wide ledge outside the cliff house door, dozing in the last of the warmth with his one good eye closed and his head hanging in the complete, boneless relaxation of a very old horse who knew he was in a safe place. The canyon her brothers had laughed at, the worthless piece of desert nobody wanted. The place her father had called, in a note she'd read so many times the paper had gone soft along the folds and tray. A place where you'll never have to ask another person for permission to exist. She thought sometimes about what she would have said to herself on that first morning, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark. What she knew now that would have helped her then. But the honest answer was that she couldn't have told herself anything useful. The knowing wasn't separate from the doing. You didn't understand what you were capable of by being told about it. You understood it by doing and surviving the thing and looking back at what you'd come through. The blisters that hardened into calluses, the chisel that dulled, and the work that continued anyway. Most of its windows were dark. The morning she'd found her father's pickaxe in the sand and felt the ground shift it under her in a way that had nothing to do with the desert. There was no shortcut to that. There was only the going through. She didn't need the world to agree with her assessment of herself. She'd learned that much. The world's opinion had not changed what was true about her when it was wrong, and its changed opinion now didn't define her any more than its prior contempt had. What she thought about herself, what she'd proven to herself, that was the accounting that mattered. And it was in balance, in a way it had never been before, and she intended to keep it that way. The light went out of the canyon walls, slowly, reluctantly, the crimson deepening to burgundy to a dark that was almost black. She went down the terrace steps and into the lower room where the lamp was burning, and the coffee was still warm, and the sound of Alden's hammer had stopped, and his footsteps were coming toward the doorway. The canyon settled into night around her. The spring ran on, as it had run before she came here, and as it would run long after, patient and cold and indifferent to what anyone thought about its value, offering itself to whoever had the sense and the stubbornness to find it. She had found it. That was the whole story. That was all of it. It was enough.